Hi, I'm Ali. I'm one of the physios from treatmyachilles.com. This video is going to be discussing how can we change and modify our yoga practice if this is something we've noticed that is adversely affecting symptoms of an Achilles tendonitis or tendinopathy. The video is going to go through some tips and tricks that you may not have thought of about how to modify some different poses, and then the principles behind that you may then use for other poses that we haven't covered in this video. The aim is then to keep you modified but continuing to do your yoga practice whilst you are going down the rehabilitation route of strengthening and making that Achilles more robust, so in the end you don't need to modify anything at all and you're back to full activity. treatmyachilles.com is an online physiotherapy service offering assessment and rehab programs to everything from an Achilles tendonitis or tendinopathy through to an Achilles tear or rupture. If you would like to find out any more information about this, please look at our website and details that can be found below. So we're just going to talk about, why might yoga cause some changes in symptoms with the Achilles tendon, and then we'll go on to look at some practical ideas. So typically with an Achilles tendinopathy and tendonitis, and that's the type of issues we're discussing today, we're not talking about tears or ruptures, that's very different, and you'll need to speak to a practitioner about when to return to yoga for that, as you'll be following a protocol based from a consultant or an orthopaedist. So if we're looking at an Achilles tendinopathy or tendonitis, what typically do we notice with symptoms? Well, symptoms can be one of two things really: stiffness feelings or pain feelings. And those stiffness feelings tend to happen first thing in the morning before we start to get up and start to walk. When we put our feet to the floor and start to move, we can feel that. And as we get going, that eases away. We also might feel it if we've been sat still or sedentary for a period of time after activity, and then we get up to start to move again. The second set of symptoms are pain, and those pain can happen at different times. Again, you might not feel it at all during activity whatsoever, but you then get what's called a latent response, or a response later on, where the pain comes on later that day or the next day. Or again, it may not be pain that's done that, it might be that your stiffness is worse later that day or the next day. So that latent response can be quite confusing and difficult, because when we start to do a piece of activity like yoga, we might be feeling completely fine, and then later that day think, oh, I'm a little bit worse, I'm hobbling a little bit more as I've got out of the chair, or again the next morning. And it's that clue is to look back at what you've done that sort of 24 hours previous to see if you can find a pattern. The other times that we can feel pain with an Achilles tendon can be at the beginning of a piece of activity. We then warm up, it goes away, and if we then do too much, it may or may not return. So things that can aggravate it are when we're working that Achilles tendon or when we're compressing that Achilles tendon. So Achilles tendon is made up of two calf muscles. Those two calf muscles come down, turn into that Achilles tendon that then attaches at the back of the heel. So if we do a lot of stretching, so a lot of movements where we're stretching our Achilles tendon, which typically involves us moving forwards, so into a dorsiflexed position, so that kind of runner's stretch, a knee to wall type movement, a warrior type movement in yoga, what we're doing then is it's a compression force. So if you've got a change in that tendon that's feeling a little bit unhappy and irritated, it brings that tendon closer to where it inserts and nearer to the bone, and therefore it's a bit like having a bruise and pressing on it. So compression forces can cause pain and symptoms, and therefore how can we change some of those stretch positions in yoga in the short term? The second thing can be when we contract it. When we contract our Achilles tendon, what we're doing is raising up onto our tiptoes or holding that position on our tiptoes for a period of time. And again, how can we adapt those movements? So one very, very quick point. I am not a yoga instructor or a yoga teacher. I have taken part in some yoga sessions in my life, but my technique is therefore about using the principle of what position we're in and how we can change that. It is not a substitute for my knowledge for yoga. Therefore, any of these principles could be worth a discussion with your yoga instructor practitioner and ask how they can be incorporated into different moves or what's happening in that class today. So starting in standing, we have typically this sort of stretch position. So what I'm talking about is a normal sort of runner's stretch would be this sort of position here, and that sort of stretch position is what's causing that compression force we discussed earlier. So those sorts of movements in yoga can be your sort of warrior type movements, or again more forward facing warrior type movements. Well, how can we adapt those? One, you can take a narrower stance, so we've got less stress going through. Two, we can get our yoga mat or a rolled towel and have a little roll in that, so my heel is now slightly higher than my toes, which takes away some of that compression element into those movements. So then if we come on to more of the typical poses like a downward dog, again that rolled towel under the heel could be quite useful, especially if we're trying to get our heels to the floor and we're reducing that stretch. Equally, if we're up, we're in a position where we're contracting that tendon for a while. So again, can you bend knees? Can you come down onto your knees and do a selection of stretches on all four? So it could be cat, camel, it could be upper half only. Again, it's worth discussing with your yoga instructor. That would also include then things like a plank movement in typical sun salutations. Again, you're coming up onto your tiptoes for a while, so can you do them on your knees for a bit? And if this position is uncomfortable, again, you could have your rolled up towel or jumper underneath to help support that position. Another thing to consider would be poses where you are holding a large amount of dorsiflexion, so that's dorsiflexion in your foot. That could be ones where you're holding and pulling your foot back towards you. These could be typically more like forward fold or hamstring stretches where you're in this position. Can you make sure your foot's relaxed and you've not got here and you've not applied any extra pressure to pull it backwards? In summary, if we think about what an Achilles tendon tends to become irritated by, it's either irritated when it has been used a lot to raise up onto tiptoes or maintain that position, or be overly stretched into that dorsiflexion position in standing like a warrior, or in a non-weight bearing, a lying or a sitting position. What can you do to modify those? Roll up to the yoga mat, use a jumper or a towel or something under your heels. Could you have a go at not pulling right back into dorsiflexion and keeping your foot nice and relaxed in more non-weight bearing poses?